And the war goes on. We're looking more in detail about the Civil War today. Look at the Peninsular Campaign, Yorktown Battle. Leads us to the Second Battle of Bull Run, also known as the Second Battle of Manassas. Antietam Campaign, Battle of Pea Ridge, Battle of Shiloh, Battle of Memphis, Fall of New Orleans, Admiral David Farragut, the Emancipation Proclamation, which is surrounding the end of slavery, battles at Vicksburg, Gettysburg, Sherman's March, and Appomattox Fortress. Any questions? All right. Among the other issues taking place during the war was that of conscription, the draft. This is the first time in American history in which there was a draft. It was initiated on both sides. Ordinarily in American history, there had simply calling for volunteers would have produced enough, but both sides facing heavy casualties in the protracted war, they needed more manpower, so they passed laws mandating that men be put into the Army. Now it starts with Independence Day 1861. Congress called for 500,000 volunteers. The Confederacy at the same time called for 100,000 volunteers to fight for 1 year. And in May 1861, Davis was authorized to call 400,000 Southerners for up to 1 year. But the problem for the Confederates was that 1 year term meant enlistment's up in 1862. War is still going on, no end in sight. So, enlistment terms ending and hesitant about, a lot of soldiers hesitant to re-enlist, recruitment downs. The Confederate government adopted conscription. So on April 16, 1862, and their call was for all men between 18 and 35 in the South declared to be members of the Army for 3 years. It just happened to turn out to be the rest of the war. Like I said, men only. Now, how they would decide how you're in the Army, when they find calling you up, active for activation, there are different ways. There's picking out names, sometimes picking out birth dates, things like that. But for those men who already were in the Army when the Confederacy started the draft, they're ordered to remain in the Army for an additional 3 years. But still, 1862 being a hard year for the South, heavy casualties, manpower shortages. September 1862, the Confederate Congress raised that age between men between 18 and 40. How bad the situation is by February 1864. All men between 17 and 50. With men under 18 and over 45 reserved for state defense. Basically, the old men, the youngest of men, basically they're at the bottom of the barrel. There were several battles which they had to pull troops from the Virginia Military Academy, just kids, to put them in the middle of the war. And there, even though putting children in combat is considered to be a war crime by international treaty today, there were no such treaties during the Civil War. You had children as young as 12, 13, 14 serving in the Army, Navy, both sides. There's this story about this commander of this Texas unit found out one of his troops was just 15. Kids lying about their age, weren't signing up, and able-bodied, no birth records. There were no birth certificates around with most states and territories. Just show up. Commander wrote in his records he was 15 and his mama came to take him home. So that had to be embarrassing.
Not bad. He gets out there for free.
Yeah. But there are exemptions in the Confederate draft system. You can pay $500 and be exempt. Of course, who has $500? Yeah. Very rich men. There were some cases of men pulling together their money so if someone was drafted, they could have paid an exemption fee. If you're a teacher with more than 20 students.
Okay, more than 20 students.
Yeah, I'd be in trouble today. Or if you owned 20 or more slaves, that is, you were a planter. And again, who owns 20 or more slaves? Very rich.
Right.
A lot of those men that did sign it were officers, but a great many of them were exempt. Because the argument was that they were needed to manage these plantations and manage the crops that were providing the resources for the South. But it's led a lot of criticisms and a lot of people saying this is a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. We can see that in a lot of criticism in a lot of wars. Rich man's war and a poor man's fight. The North, they began conscription in March of 1863, calling it men between 20 and 45. There are exemptions to state office holders and those who could hire a substitute, that is, pay somebody to fight for you.
Really?
I kid you not. State office holders, but there actually were cases of both sides of officers in the field actually running for office during the war, even though they weren't necessarily in their home state or anything. One general ran for lieutenant governor of Virginia during the war while he's laying waste to West Virginia. Actually, one of my ancestors. Governor Harris Flanagan, the last Confederate governor of Arkansas, he ended up, he was serving in Tennessee when he was nominated and won the election as governor. Exemptions for state office holders could hire a substitute or pay $300.
So in other words, soldiers stand right here.
Yep, pretty much. But there were a lot of men interested in signing up and volunteering, and what the Union Army is doing, they're paying a lot of huge cash bonuses. You had federal bonuses, plus you had states and even counties offering bonuses. So if someone is willing to enlist on their own, and plus be hired as a substitute, they can make a nice little payday off of this. Also, a lot of northern firms making a bunch of money selling life insurance to soldiers. Because making a bet, look at the numbers of who actually served versus who actually died in combat. Actually, we're making a safe bet. So there were a lot of people trying to make money off this war too. But interestingly enough, for the North, the draft produced 46,000 conscripts. And produced 118,000 substitutes. And the North already has better than 2-to-1 superiority in manpower already. The South already hobbled by the fact they're holding slaves against their will, and they're not going to arm the slaves. But even though the North is taking very heavy casualties, it was leading to a lot of very heavy criticisms of Lincoln and how the war is being conducted, they were, the North always had this steady supply of manpower. You had more people than the South, plus you have the draft, plus you have men willing to volunteer in the enlist, plus you have a steady stream of immigrants coming in. And after 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln starts arming African Americans in the North. So the South saw the North just kept coming and coming and coming. But both sides had strong criticisms of the draft as unconstitutional. And it's led to a lot of constitutional and legal questions over the years. I mean, technically, look at read the Constitution on both sides. There's nothing specifically that says draft or conscription. But it does say the government shall preserve a republican form of government in each state. The government shall defend itself. So how it does that, that's open to a lot of interpretation. But a lot of criticism of the draft as being unconstitutional. The Confederate vice president opposed the draft. The Georgia governor, even though he had an excellent record of recruitment in his state, became a vocal opponent of the draft and actually tried to obstruct its enforcement. Talked about the New York draft riots. It's in starting July 11th, 1863, the announcement of a draft lottery in New York touched off a week of rioting, the worst civil disturbances in American history. Left more than 120 dead and $120 million in damage. Should be well over $1 billion in today's money. In fact, it was so bad, the Union troops who were pursuing Confederate troops after the end of the Battle of Gettysburg had to pull away from the pursuit of Lee to go to New York to restore order. And of course, the people making money off it. You got the very bizarre story of what can be called the dead horse claims. Interesting little story. Well, the Army needed supplies, and many of the North tried to take advantage of the situation. They delivered tents with holes in them, sold rotten meat to the Army, poorly manufactured equipment, sick or dead horses. This Army ordered horses. They didn't have to say whether they're alive or not. Yeah. And demanded compensation. So we come to the case of J.P. Morgan in May of 1861. J.P. Morgan, after the war, ran one of the largest and most powerful banks in New York. And how he made one of his early fortunes? Fraud. May 1861, the Army is calling for weapons and offered top dollar for any. Well, the Union commander of the garrison in St. Louis got a telegram from a man in New York, J.P. Morgan, offering 5,000 new rifles in perfect condition. St. Louis commander offered $22 a piece for them. It's a very good price, though. Well, the problem was these rifles had faulty firing mechanisms. They would explode, sometimes blowing the thumbs off of soldiers who were firing them. And where did Morgan get all these rifles? From the Federal Arsenal in New York. They were getting rid of these defective rifles as they were thoroughly unserviceable and dangerous and trying to sell them for $3.50 a piece. Well, Morgan hears about this and decides he's going to buy up all these worthless rifles in New York and sell them to the Army commander in St. Louis. Yeah. To get it, he got a loan from a New York bank using the Army voucher as collateral. St. Louis commander bought them sight unseen, found out the guns were worthless, and refused payment for them. J.P. Morgan then sued the Army in federal court. And the judge agreed with them, ordering the government to pay $109,000 for Morgan, setting the precedent for the dead horse claims.
He just made a good move, right?
Yeah. How many people died or maimed because of it?
That's what I was going to say.
Now, the Union was relying on, or the war on the Anaconda strategy devised by Winfield Scott before he retired. The Army of the Potomac, a special army devoted just to defending the District of Columbia, and exert constant pressure on Richmond. Meantime, a southern blockade would dry up southern access to foreign goods, dividing the Confederacy by taking its main waterways, basically twining and crushing it, the Anaconda strategy. Confederates are applying on a different strategy, called King Cotton diplomacy. Essentially, they're trying to force foreign intervention in the American Civil War.
I think we had a King Cotton Blues Fest every year.
South Cotton was king even after the war.
Every year in Archer.
But here's the deal. South is producing so much cotton that it's selling it to French and British textile factories, making a fortune off of this. Well, these textile factories are vital parts of the economies of Britain and France at this point. In fact, about a quarter of British factory workers were working in textile factories. So Southerners are hoping that using that kind of economic leverage, they could use the cotton as loans on the international marketplace. But with the Union blockading the South, the European factories would have no access to cotton for their factories, cause economic pressure on them, and force them to intervene to save their own economies. Even though slavery was illegal in England and France throughout all their imperial holdings. Well, problem was 1860 was a bumper year for cotton. The South produced more of it than it needed, sold all in the European marketplace, so England and France have this surplus of cotton, and during the war they started finding other sources of cotton. So the economic pressure on England and France never materialized. But there were other issues for the South, particularly France. In 1862, France took over Mexico over a debt dispute, placed a puppet government in place. Basically, they're trying to expand their influences in North America. The only reason they're able to do this is because the Union Army is just a little bit distracted in 1862. Other things they're trying to deal with at this point. Of course, this caused a huge uproar in Mexico, revolutions and battles lasting for years. Cinco de Mayo, that was celebrating one battle, one victory over the French during those wars on the 5th of May. Huge celebration this day. And Napoleon III was wanting to hold Mexico, but believed the best way to do that was make sure that the United States was divided, so the United States Army could not come in and intervene in Mexico. So the French are considering, by 1862 and 1863, recognizing the Confederacy as an independent nation and even intervening and supporting the Confederacy. But they would do so only if Britain would do so. But Britain wasn't interested. They thought about it, but they wanted to see if the South could win a major battle on its own. The South could win a lot of little battles, but they could never deliver that knockout punch. Not like an Antietam or a Gettysburg. They could not win one of those battles. So since they couldn't, Great Britain wasn't going to back a bad horse and let the South go on its own. There were several incidents which Britain and the United States threatened to go to war with each other. In fact, the American Secretary of State, William H. Seward, that was his job during the entire war. Keep Europe out of the war. Threaten, plead, do whatever it took to keep England and France intervening in the war. Warning them if they recognized the Confederacy or took any kind of action to support the Confederacy, it would mean war with the United States. Then we talked about the Trent affair. The steamer was the British ship, the Trent. What happened in 1861 was it's leaving South Carolina with 2 Confederate diplomats aboard who were going to Britain to try to negotiate with the British government. Well, the Trent was caught by a Union naval patrol, and they arrested the 2 diplomats aboard. Of course, Britain's upset because international water. This is a British ship, and the Americans stopped and took passengers off that ship. On all the same arguments, U.S. gets Britain in the War of 1812. Well, Britain's threatening war against this, and Lincoln decides it's one war at a time. That was his word to Seward. And they released the diplomats back to the Trent and back to England. But it was all for nothing. The British never recognized the Confederacy. Meanwhile, on the home front, the Confederates are hoping they could outlast Northern will to fight. Basically, inflict heavy casualties, make it impossible for the North to seize any kind of territory in the South, just basically wear down their will to fight. Fight them to a stalemate. If they couldn't do that, then the alternative strategy was simply capture the District of Columbia. It's right there on the border of Virginia. If they could capture Washington, D.C., they felt the war would be over. But they could never do either. Well, one of the first battles between ironclad ships took place in early 1862. The Confederacy converted an old Union steam frigate, the Merrimac, into an ironclad. Most common ship in those days, basically taking a wooden-hulled ship, put metal plates on the side of it. It was rechristened the Virginia and set out to wreak havoc on the Union ships in Chesapeake Bay. The Union ironclad, the Monitor, fought it to a draw, and the Virginia retreated back to Norfolk Harbor. Though Norfolk was taken a short time later, the Virginia had to be scuttled. Confederacy also tried a submarine, CSS Hunley. Basically, it was designed to basically sneak up underwater on Union ships, attach bombs to the hulls, sneak off, and the bombs explode and sink the ships. Actually, it was reasonably successful as a submersible, but in 1864, on its maiden voyage, it was sunk. The Union Navy attempted to build its own submarine, but could never make it work. Well, the Navy would slowly extend its bases along the coast. In fact, one fort in the Florida Keys was held by the Union forces throughout the war, never yielded to the Confederates. And the Navy also won some of the first and most important early victories in the war for the Union, particularly here at New Orleans. Sir Admiral Farragut comes in. Battle of Mobile Bay, he's the one who gave the famous statement, damn torpedoes, full speed ahead. Torpedoes were submarine mines. Well, Farragut actually is a Southerner serving in the Navy. Spring of 1862, he forced open the mouth of the Mississippi River and surprised the defenders of New Orleans, taking the city on May 1st, 1862. A week later, he took nearby Baton Rouge, just a little ways further up the river. So the major cities of Louisiana fell to Union forces. Southern access to the Gulf of Mexico by way of the all-important Mississippi River was cut off. Baton Rouge and New Orleans would be held by Union forces throughout the remainder of the war. The Confederate capitals then moved to Shreveport for the remainder of the war, but Union forces were never able to take Shreveport. Stuck in southern Louisiana. In the far west, that is even west of the Texas westward, there's very little activity during the war, except for a few interesting episodes. Western settlement continued, transportation, communications networks emerged, like telegraph lines. Dakota, Colorado, and Nevada were given territorial status in 1861. Kansas was admitted as a free state in 1861. Colorado became important because of silver finds in the area. There's a lot of valued Native Americans, though, but as the silver mines played out, the population of Colorado dwindled. Nevada found so much silver in its mountains, it was made a state in 1864, just after West Virginia. In fact, all the silver being found in Nevada and Colorado basically helped the Union pay for the war effort. So no such silver strikes being found in the South, and basically their debts increased steadily. Western forts were largely vacated. Soldiers headed east to fight the war. So the Indian Territory, Texas were abandoned. Those left with a handful of soldiers to defend the areas. Tribes attacked Union Confederate positions alike. But in the Indian Territory, a lot of the tribes had been moved there during the 1830s during the Trail of Tears, did side with the Confederacy. The Confederacy briefly occupied the New Mexico Territory. After a series of battles, the Confederates were beaten back in 1862 and resulted in the creation of the Arizona and New Mexico territories. Battle of Key Ridge proves to be an important battle. It's in the spring of 1862. It's in northwest Arkansas, not far from Fayetteville, Bentonville, and all those areas. What happened was Arkansas officials feared an attack from Kansas Unionists into northwest Arkansas for some time, so they're trying to build up their forces. But the attack through Kansas never comes because, one thing, Native Americans in the Indian Territory are mostly allied with the Confederates or stayed neutral. But there is an attack that does come from southwest Missouri. Confederate soldiers meet them here at the Battle of Key Ridge. It's called the Battle of Elkhorn Tavern. It's called that because there's this little tavern there at the battle site that had these little elk horns above the door. Battle goes back and forth over 2 days, heavy casualties on both sides. But on the second day of the battle, Confederate forces have to withdraw. Casualties simply too heavy. Whatever happened is because of this. This was the largest battle west of the Mississippi River in the entire Civil War. So the battle site's still there, still nicely maintained, still the Elkhorn Tavern still there. Take tours of the area. But what the Confederates were hoping to do was, if they could win here, they could push into Missouri and help Claiborne Jackson and his secessionist forces in Missouri seize control of the Missouri state government. But because of this, Confederates are unable to offer assistance to Jackson. Confederate strength in Missouri just withers away. So most of the war ends up taking place that whole area from the Mississippi River out to the Atlantic coast. But even then, it's basically divided into two areas. The Eastern Theater, as it's called, is simply the area in and around Washington, D.C. and Richmond. Most of the war basically taking place in 100 miles of Washington. The eastern theater is basically an area east of the Appalachian Mountains. And here you see General Ulysses S. Grant. Often called the U.S. Grant, or Unconditional Surrender Grant. His West Point graduate had returned from lackluster civilian life, but led his troops to success on the Western Front, in the Western states. He had, says, a poor businessman, a failure at everything in civilian life, roaring alcoholic, but had to be an effective commander. On February 6, 1862, Grant captured the Confederate Fort Henry on the Cumberland River, northern Tennessee, and took Fort Donelson, also on the Cumberland River, 10 days later. Grant took 14,000 prisoners at these two battles and forced the Confederates to retreat from Kentucky and central Tennessee. As a result, within a very short time, the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers are both under Union control, two of the three major rivers that Scott had identified. We also had the Battle at Shiloh. In April 1862, Southern forces were massing at Corinth, Mississippi, just near the border of Tennessee. And Confederates saw a slow-moving Union force just across the line move to attack it here at the Battle of Shiloh, just in southwestern Tennessee. Confederates launched a surprise attack on April 6th. It proved to be one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Initially, it looked like it was going to be a Confederate victory, but Union reinforcements stepped in and stemmed the tide, prevented the Union Army from being annihilated. On April 7th, after a second fierce day of fighting, Confederates withdrew from the area back into Mississippi. But the end result was, while Confederate forces were unable to force the Union forces from the area, they delayed the Union takeover of the Mississippi River Valley. But it was to be a short delay. Memphis fell to Union forces on June 6, 1862. Well, Lincoln, meanwhile, is having a lot of problems with generals. They just won't fight. They're very poor generals, losing battles that should easily have been won. Lincoln had some generals who were so bad that some historians have actually questioned their loyalty. But case in point here, General George McClellan. Overall commander of Union forces after the Battle of First Bull Run. In early 1862, because McClellan would not attack, McClellan relieved McClellan of command, put him in command of the Army of the Potomac, and ordered him to attack. McClellan was dragging his heels, saying he needed more men, he needed more time to train his men, and he's always afraid that he's going to take high casualties, and he's going to lose the battle, he's going to be outnumbered. As a sound tactician, he could plan a good battle, he just could not execute one very well. In fact, on one occasion, frustrated by McClellan's lack of progress, Lincoln wrote to him and said, quote, "If you're not using your army, I should like to borrow it for a while."
Yeah.
Well, McClellan ends up in early 1862 opting for an unusual attack. Let's got, say this, Virginia, Washington, D.C. We'll pretend this is to scale. Richmond. You got Richmond, you got D.C. Instead of trying to go from the north, attacking Richmond directly, Bay area, McClellan is going to take the Navy and attack from the east. So his little peninsula is kind of spilling into Chesapeake and the Atlantic Oceans. It can be called the Peninsular Campaign. Basically expecting Confederate defense to be concentrated on the north and not expecting an attack from the east. Well, McClellan lands at Fortress Monroe, begins moving up the peninsula in early April 1862, but he's bogged down at the Battle of Yorktown, the same one where American forces fought the British at the end of the American Revolution 80 years before. He spent a month besieging the city, which fell to the Union Army on May 4th, and pushed ahead position just 20 miles shy of Richmond and stopped, expecting Lincoln's going to send reinforcements from Washington. But what ends up happening, though, is Stonewall Jackson is attacking Union positions here in the Shenandoah Valley, forcing Union forces to try to protect Washington. McClellan's down on his own here just east of Richmond, but he won't attack. He had the manpower to do it if he wanted to, he just didn't. That's why he's organizing his armies. Confederate forces are planning their defense and planning a counterattack. They notice major gaps in McClellan's defenses and unleash their forces on McClellan. Well, the Battle of Seven Pines, Virginia, Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston took advantage of McClellan's divided forces and attacked him on May 31st. McClellan barely managed to keep his army intact, but was forced from the Richmond area. It's this point that Robert E. Lee comes back into the picture. He had been named Commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, basically the counterpart to the Army of the Potomac. Lee's not going to be overall commander of the Confederate forces until the very end of the war. Based for that time, Army of Northern Virginia is all that's left. Well, Johnson is severely injured. Robert E. Lee assumes command of the Army of Northern Virginia. At the end of June, Lee organized an effort to expel McClellan from Virginia entirely. In the 7 days battle, Lee and McClellan clashed from about June 25th to July 1st, basically north of the area here, forcing McClellan back across the border. Lincoln was convinced that the Peninsular Campaign was a lost cause, agreed with McClellan's decision to pull back to Washington, D.C., but he relieves McClellan in the process, appointing General Henry Halleck to command Union forces. But Halleck isn't any better than McClellan. In fact, actually, even worse. Halleck ordered McClellan to join General John Pope to be on an overland attack on Richmond. Union forces are going to try to regroup and attack Richmond again, but McClellan, upset that he's been relieved of command, said he's relieved of command, drags his heels. Pope is left exposed, and Lee gets to Union forces before McClellan does, annihilating Pope's army. By the end of August, they had pushed Union army back to Bull Run, where the whole war started a year before. This time, Lee decisively defeats Union forces and pushes on further north into Maryland. Well, Halleck is so inept that he's fired by Lincoln, and McClellan's put back in command by Lincoln out of desperation. After a couple of points, Lincoln actually considers taking command of the army himself and leading troops to the battle. Well, Lee at this point is hoping to invade Maryland in order to cut off Washington, D.C. from the rest of the Union. So, this is the Antietam campaign. Lee's invasion of Maryland would be successful in the onslaught, but there were several problems on the way that There are a lot of Unionists in Maryland, very frightened of Confederate troops, but Lee is trying to lay the public, ordering his troops not to harass civilians, ordering them to sing the state song while they march along, Maryland, my Maryland. The Confederate troops are having their own problems. See, Maryland had a lot of gravel roads, and these troops have marched hundreds of miles, and their boots have fallen apart. Some have signed up and entered the Army without any shoes at all. So a lot of these men are barefoot. So having to march on gravel rocks, you ever walked on gravel in your bare feet?
Yeah.
It doesn't feel very good. Well, imagine having to do that for several miles. It says wearing out his troops and slowing down their advance. Well, finally, McClellan organizes his troops and meets Lee at the Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862. This is the bloodiest day in American history, September 17, 1862. They meet up just outside of Sharpsburg, Maryland, at Antietam Creek. Two are fighting back and forth for hours. Said no clear winner of the battle, but casualties are intense. They're fighting for absolutely everything at this point. Lee is convinced if he can win this battle, he can win the war. And McClellan realizes just how perilous the Union position is at this point. Not ever, of course, admitting it was actually his fault. Well, Confederates suffer more than 10,000 dead and wounded in this battle, but not before inflicting 13,000 Union dead and injured. So 23,000 dead and injured on this day. Technically, the battle's a draw. Neither one advanced. But Lee had taken so many heavy casualties that he has to withdraw. McClellan does not pursue Lee. Southern armies have taken so many heavy casualties. But he's satisfied that he had pushed a Lee back across the Potomac River. But because McClellan refused to pursue Lee back into Virginia, he again stripped McClellan of his command. But while the battle was technically a draw, it was enough of a victory that the northern capital saved, and Lincoln decided to start proceeding with emancipation, issuing the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd. Now, since the beginning of the war, there have been questions what to do with slavery. Lincoln was hesitant to make it a war for abolition because he was fearful of how white troops were going to react to fighting for the lives of African Americans. But already there were several Union commanders, whenever they captured plantations, they had to order all the slaves freed. So there was no clear policy in effect yet. Now, by 1862, slavery had been abolished in the District of Columbia and in the remaining territories. With the Southerners no longer in Congress, there's no one to obstruct the North from doing this. So Lincoln decides, after a lot of lobbying and a lot of careful consideration, that he's issuing this warning to the South that if Confederate forces did not stand down within 90 days, he'd order slaves in all areas under Confederate control free. Now, what he's doing is he's trying to attack the economy and the culture of the South. Or he's trying to break the Southern ability to make wars, warning them, keep your slaves if you stop now. But if you don't, all the slaves will be freed in areas you control if we retake that territory. Now, it's kind of a middle ground effort. Lincoln had said repeatedly if he could end the war without freeing slaves, he would do it. But if he could end the war by freeing all the slaves, he would do it. But basically his main goal, at least officially, was in slavery, in the war. Lincoln was not a slave owner, was not a fan of slavery. In fact, the first slave auction he ever saw was as a congressman. Saw a slave auction in the District of Columbia and was absolutely sickened by it. And often said of slavery, of people who said, people who think slavery is a good idea, I think I'd have to try it on them for a while. But by the end of December, Union forces, Confederate forces had not responded. So on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, ordering slaves in all areas under Confederate control free. That is, as Union troops advanced into those areas, those slaves would be considered free. And ultimately, this would be responsible for freeing a quarter of the slaves in the war. The 13th Amendment at the end of the war will free the remainder. But 1863 proves to be a difficult year for the Confederacy. Basically, it's do or die time for the Confederacy. They are facing serious shortages of food on the home front. In fact, there are bread riots in Richmond. The housewives are upset that there's nothing there to feed their families. Farms have been abandoned. Farms are being destroyed by marching armies. 1863, Lincoln placed General Fighting Joe Hooker in command. Hooker had often said that he believed the nation needed a dictator for the duration of the war, causing Lincoln some consternation. But Hooker has his chance to battle Chancellorsville in Virginia. And here's what he does. He marches his 130,000 troops in an uphill, fortified position against the Confederates. Like I say, what should have been an easy victory, but because Hooker chooses a very bad place to advance, uphill against a fortified position, Union forces get to cut to shreds. Hooker is fired, but it's this battle where Stonewall Jackson gets killed. All the smoke and fog, just shot by his own troops by accident.
Would this also be considered the Confederates' last victory in the Civil War?
One of the last major ones. They're going to win some little ones here and there, but it's because of what happened at Chancellorsville that Lee decides to press his advantage and try to repeat what they did the year before. An invasion of the North, try to take the capital. That would be the Gettysburg campaign. But also, Union forces are advancing along the Mississippi River, preparing to take them out in Vicksburg. So the summer of 1863 is going to be the decisive moment for the Civil War.